Welcome, life science learners, to another installment on scientific methodology. Today, we're going to look at how we represent data in a scientific experiment. Let's reflect on what we've done over the past couple lessons. So previously, we looked at scientific method, where we've discussed how to set up an experiment, how to identify different variables, how to look at controlling an experiment in terms of ensuring that it is a fair test. Today, we're looking at what happens when we've conducted an experiment and we've collected that raw data. Let's look at how we represent that data. Representing data is very important because if you do not know how to represent the data, you're not able to see the trends, you're not able to extrapolate or draw inferences and conclusions from that. So in science, representing data is crucial for scientists to be able to see trends, for us to be able to draw inferences from it. So it's quite an intricate science in terms of how we represent data. So let's get straight into that and look at how we represent data. So guys, if we think about data, have you ever thought about the following? Whether you're the world's greatest detective trying to crack a case or a person trying to solve a problem at work, you're going to need information. You're going to look at facts and data, as Sherlock Holmes would have said. So we're constantly surrounded by data, information, visual, stimulus that come in, and that information is being processed. When conducting an experiment, there's lots of information that we see. So there's different types of data that we can establish. So let's look at how we look at data, how we interpret that data, and how we present that data. So as we're going to look at in today's lessons, we've got to discuss what is data. We've got to look at what are quantities of data, how information can give us data, how information is presented in the form of graphs, how measurements are important to establishing data correctly, how when observing experiments that data can be generated, looking at facts that are available as information that supports data, and looking at how numbers can all give you data. So data is present everywhere. It's how we use that data in an experiment and present that information that's important. So some key words in today's lesson would be, as I mentioned, the word data. We've looked at variables in the past, and we know that there are three different types of variables: the dependent variable, the independent variable, and the controlled or the constant variables. And so we've unpacked these, and we'll talk more about these as we get into the lesson. We also need to look at how data is represented using line graphs, a bar graph, a histogram, pie charts, how that information is analyzed, how conclusions are drawn, to look at the relationship between variables, the concepts of interpolating and extrapolating information. So those are key words that will be used in our lesson today. So let's try and understand what is data or data. Data are units of information. Data can be collected on any topic and for any purpose, meaning that it is used in everything from scientific research and finance to business, management, and retail. So we are constantly supporting information. The fact that you walk into a mall, there's data around the number of people that move into that mall. You use your phone, there's information around the number of times you've used your phone. Google can track data, and that data talks about information that they can use to help retailers. The fact that when you write a test at school, that data is collected and it's used to generate a promotion mark at the end of the year, that is presenting the data. Your report that you get at the end of the year is data that's consolidated and presented together to determine whether you've passed or failed or how well you've done. So we've got to look at, in science, how we present that data and draw conclusions from that. So in schools, data is often collected, as I said, in science, in maths, through investigations. Importantly, there are two main types of data, and we refer to them as qualitative and quantitative. And let's pause at this moment. Let's try and understand the word quantity and quality. And if you unpack the words quality, it refers to the properties of things. So when you describe the color of something, the texture, the number of bubbles, those are describing the quality of a result. So if there's a dark color, if there's an intense precipitate that's formed, that is the quality of the results. However, you also can measure substances, you can measure quantities. So those quantities that are measured are quantifiable, meaning we can put a number to that. So that the length, the size, the height, the width, the time it takes, the amount of rainfall, those are all measurable data. And we refer to that as quantitative, meaning quantities. So let's try and unpack that a little further. So quantitative data deals with numbers and things that can be measured objectively. Dimensions such as height, width, and length are all quantities. Temperature and humidity, prices, area and volume are all quantities that can be measured, and we refer to these as quantitative measurables. And that often gives us quantities around specific dependent variables. We also have, as I mentioned, qualitative data, and this deals with characteristics and descriptions that can't be easily measured but can be observed subjectively, such as the smell of something, the taste, the texture, the attractiveness, and the color. So in science, we often rely on things and observations around the rate of a reaction by looking at the amount of gas, by looking at the number of bubbles that are produced, by looking at the amount of products. So if you can physically see a property and you're able to determine from that if the reaction is occurring or not, or if the products are being produced, we refer to that as being a qualitative result. And we'll talk about the differences of these in terms of the reliability in a scientific investigation when we measure these. How is data collected? Data collection is a process of gathering and measuring information on variables of interest in a systemic fashion, which enables one to answer stated research questions or to test a hypothesis. This can be done through the following: through doing a survey, through polls, having an interview with an individual, having focus group discussions, looking at observations, and carrying out experiments. So if you were to go around and if you were to do a census, which is counting the number of people in a country, that would be done through a survey. A survey would go around and you'll collect information through questions that individuals would answer. So that gives us information, and that information talks to the number of people in the country and their income, the literacy rate, the number of dependents, the education rate. That's the survey. We also do polls, and you would see that when you're watching the elections, you will see the polls, you will see the number of voters that have voted for someone, and that's often counting the number of individuals voting. So we refer to that as polls. One-to-one interviews. So if you were being interviewed by your peers around how you use water and the amount of water that you spend, or what mode of transport, in terms of trying to establish your impact on the environment, that would be an interview. And interviews often give you information that can be presented graphically, but also can be processed together to give you a better understanding around a specific measurable. We also know that there are focus group discussions where an interviewer would get information from a few individuals around a specific topic. So we have focus group discussions. We also have observations that can be made by looking at how things take place. So when you see an experiment taking place, and if you notice that there are bubbles, or if you can feel the texture, or if you can look at the quantity or the shape or the size of something, then that is an observation that you're making around a physical property. As we also mentioned, that there are experiments that generate numerical or quantitative data that can be recorded. So these are the different ways in which data can be collected. Let's look most importantly how data is presented. And often the best way to present data is in tables, where we group the data and we process that information so that we can present that information in a way that it's easier to read or it's easier to understand. So collecting the information is important, but presenting that information in a way, in a manner that's illustrative, that is easier to see trends, is important to the researcher. So we refer to that as the presentation of data. A table is a grid consisting of horizontal rows and vertical columns. This gives us a useful way to display information that needs to be compared. So often at school you would be referred to draw a table of your observations. Why do we do that? It's important for us to be able to do that so that we can present that information to see the patterns. And often a table is used to be able to convert that information into a graph. And so presenting information in tables is important in processing that information. So there are really two types of tables. The first type of table is for entering the measured data. We call that a quantitative data, which can then be used to construct a graph. The second type of table is used for comparing the non-numerical information, such as the properties which I mentioned earlier on, around the smell, the taste, the color, the texture. These are called, when we refer to them as qualitative data. Okay, so we're going to need to look at how we draw tables and record that information. So yes, you've drawn tables before, but it's important to follow a system. So generally, tables go down the page. The independent variable must be on the first column and clearly labeled. The dependent variable must be in the second column with headings. They should be row headings showing the characteristics that are being compared if it is appropriate. They should be units, which is the quantity being measured. And these units must only be in the heading and not in the body of the table. So we put that into the heading. No units in the body of the table. Okay, so before we get into a break, guys, here's an example of a table. Clearly, I've given you a table heading. I've got clearly the columns as you see. I've got columns going down. I've got rows. And each of these columns have a heading. So here we've measured the grasshopper's mass. And we've looked at the length of these grasshoppers. And we've recorded that for 5 different grasshoppers. So clearly here we're recording the different grasshopper and we're recording their lengths. And as I mentioned, we've got to indicate the units in only the heading of the columns. We've also recorded the mass of these, and I've indicated that here. And I've prepared that in a table where I have complete borders that are clearly outlined, and I've given this table a clear heading. So in short, we've presented information around 5 different grasshoppers that have been measured, their lengths, their mass, in a table that makes that information more accessible, easier to look at. And so we've looked at how we present that information in a table. So guys, you've done well. We've looked at presenting information now. Let's look at how we present that information in a graph or different types of graphs when we get back after a short break. So refreshen up, and I'll see you in a little while. Welcome back, Life Science learners, to our second installment for today. Just recap on what we've just looked at. So in our first segment, we're looking at how we represent data. So we've looked at different types of data. We've looked at how to collect information. We also mentioned how information could be processed and put into a table. And we know that tables are important. It's important in organizing that information. However, we know that tables are not the best way to see that information. Often, a scientist will require a visual stimulus or something that's an illustration that you can see trends or see information. So the best way to do that is to present that information in a graph. So we've got to be able to know what are the different types of graph and what is the best way to represent information and which type of graph. So let's recollect on the types of graphs that you've been exposed to. So we know what line graphs are, and so line graphs tend to show how information is shared on a continuous basis. We also know that there are bar graphs, and bar graphs tend to be information that is non-consistent but can be illustrated, showing you the change in, and I mentioned this earlier on, a bar graph could be used to illustrate information where we talk comparing an age cohort to a different age cohort, or males and females, or the average rain in the year 2019 compared to the average rain in the year 2020. So those are comparisons where a large group can be compartmentalized into different segments. So we use a bar graph. We also can use histograms, which shows how information is continuous, but grouped information being continuous. So a histogram is slightly different to a bar graph, where we see continuous information being illustrated using bars. We also know that there is pie charts, and often we scare away from pie charts because it requires a bit of math and using a protractor to measure angles and to calculate how these proportions are illustrated in a pictorial. So today we're going to look at, in this segment, we're going to look at how to draw a line graph and how to plot a pie chart and use the information of both to be able to draw bar graphs and histograms. So let's get straight into looking at what graphs are. So graphs and charts basically condense large amounts of information into a format that is easier to understand, showing important points clearly and effectively. Line graphs show the relationship between two types of information where the independent variable is continuous. Line graphs are useful in showing trends over time and are often used for biological data. So as I said, it's often the independent variable which is continuously occurring. We place that on the x-axis and we look at the trends that happen over a period of time or over a period of temperature, where the temperature is changing. So we see progression from one to the next. We also know that bar graphs show different categories of data, as I mentioned, and are used when the independent variable is not a set of continuous numbers or continuous groups. We refer to that as being discontinuous data. They are best used to compare values across categories. So example, the average age of individuals in grade 10 compared to the average age of average number of individuals in grade 11 that are 13 years or 14 years. I would hate to think that someone is 13 or 14 in grade 11, but probably grade 7 or 8. So we're looking at a group of learners in primary school that are aged between, say, 13 and 14. So we would group that information together and we'd compare that to another group of boys in that age category. So here we're separating information. It's not continuous, and we're not able to draw trends, but we're able to group them into a category and present that as a bar on a graph. Okay, cool. Histograms have connected bars displaying continuous data, meaning the information from one leads to the next group. They're used when the values of the independent variable are continuous but fit into categories or groups that follow on after each other. So the example would be the average rainfall in Jan, the average rainfall in February, the average rainfall in March. So that would be measuring the amount of rain that has fallen for 30 or 31 days and putting that into a bar, and we continue that with an attached bar, and we refer to that as a histogram because the information here is continuous with each other. Okay, the fourth type of graph are pie charts, and these are basically circular charts that are used to compare parts of the whole. So we say that that's an illustration of how different proportions make up the complete set of information. These are divided into sectors that are equal in size and to the quantity represented. So we say proportionately. They are often used for discontinuous data. And we'll look at examples of how a pie chart is plotted for in. Let's see how to draw a line graph in life sciences. So the first step is identifying what the dependent and the independent variable is. And we look at the information, and that's established by usually looking at the table. So if you've got the table, and you know that the table we've just looked at has the independent variable on the vertical column, and we identify that first, and that's important to us, identifying where to place that. We then look for the dependent variable, and this is the variable or the factor that is being measured, that is used to measure or to determine the conclusion of an experiment. It could be the temperature in degrees Celsius, and we'll look at that in the table that I've placed on the next slide. So let's look at an example of that. The independent variable is that the variable that the investigator is changing or manipulating. The dependent variable changes as the independent variable changes. So the time in hours is the example of an independent variable. So let's move on to the next slide. So here we've got a table which illustrates the time, and we've looked at how that temperature changes over a period of time. We know that here along this column we have the independent variable, and that's easy for us to identify. And here we have the variable that is changing, and we refer to this as the dependent variable. So we've clearly identified from this table the different variables, which is firstly important to placing them on the axes. The second step is to draw a set of axes and label the x and y axes on the graph. The dependent variable goes on the y-axis, and the independent variable goes on the x-axis. Include the unit in each label. Example, temperature in degrees Celsius and time in hours or minutes. Do not forget to label the axes. And often I have learners that ask me, well, how do you remember which is the independent and dependent variable and which axes they go on? So I often use this as a simple illustration. So remember the word independent, so I'm writing that here, I. If you see my I, that's independent. So that goes on the x-axis. And the word dependent starts with the letter D, so that goes on your y-axis. So if you remember independent and where the capital I falls on, and that would be your x-axis, and the dependent, the vertical line in that, means that the dependent should be on your y-axis. And that's one simple way of helping you remember where to place them. How to draw a line graph would then require you to be able to draw a set of axes and choose a scale. So choosing a scale is important. For you to be able to choose a scale, you must look at the range of your results or range of values in a table. And often you look at the lowest value and the highest value, and you try and fit those proportionately on your x-axis or your y-axis. And so scale refers to the proportion in which you represent the units on the x and y-axis. So you simply cannot take a value from the table and write that down onto your x-axis. These values need to be proportionately in scale to each other. So if you look at my graph, you can see that I've got the time in intervals of 2 units, and this indicates the scale being consistently 2 units increasing as we move along the x-axis. On the y-axis we have temperature, and we can clearly see that temperature is in units of 5, and the proportion of the scale is in regular units of 5. So that's the first thing we need to do, is draw the axes. We've labeled the axes, so we've got a mark for the unit, and we've got a mark for labeling the y-axis with the units. So let's look at the next step. Step 3, we chose the scale, the x and y axes have been labeled. Now we make sure that we included the scale, done. We included the highest number from the table, and we've also ensured that the values are not directly plotted from the graph, but we've taken them and we've put them into a scale, and we refer to that as using a scale unless otherwise stated. So we have to have the values scaled down correctly. Let's look at step 4. How do we plot these points? So we place a dot at the point where the 2 values for each result intersect or meet. In the example, which is on the next slide, the point where 5 hours and 24 degrees intersect on the graph is indicated by a second dot on the graph. You've got to plot all these points using information from the table. So I've done that for you, and clearly, so I've looked at the first point being 5, so I've used my ruler and I've plotted that up this way, and on the y-axis we've got at 5 minutes the temperature was 25 degrees, and so that's where it intersects, and I place a simple small dot that makes it clearly visible for me. The next intercept would be at 8 minutes, and the temperature was approximately, I'm going to go by that, and that's what it is there. So it's probably 9 minutes, and the temperature was around that. And so I will place a dot at these and move on, referring to my table, plotting these points. Okay, let's look at step 5. Now we've got to join these dots using a ruler until all the dots have been joined in sequence. Now, I know that sometimes your teachers encourage you to use a free hand, which is simply going and connecting the points together. I'm going to go back to this and I'll show you how I would have done that. So you follow the dots and you connect them freehand. And this could be done in science. I know that you're encouraged to use a ruler to do that. So look at the instructions. You either use your ruler, and if you don't trust your hands, and if you've got hands that do not draw straight lines, then do them with a ruler. The next step would be give the graph a heading and a caption. Anything, a table or a graph without a heading means it's nameless, and you want to give that graph or a table a heading. The heading has to include both the variables, meaning that it must have both the independent and the dependent variables. If we go back to this table or this graph, it's going to be a graph showing the change in temperature over a period of time. Okay, so I've included both the dependent variables as well as the independent variables in my heading. So let's look at that again. So in this case, it's the air temperature, and the time period over 24 hours must be mentioned. The sixth step would be give the graph a heading, and as I said that, and it should include both the variables. Okay, we're going to move on to how that would look. Sometimes you get two lines that are being represented, so it would be the temperature for two different individuals. And it's important that if you had to plot this, you would need to give this a key. And a key, or in some textbooks, we refer to that as a legend, would be an illustration that allows an individual to be able to identify the difference in this case between the one reading, which is for temperature, and in the other reading for rainfall. So if the red line represented rainfall, we would need to indicate that in the key. So keys are important, and it makes the interpretation of that information much easier. So guys, we've looked at how to present information in a line graph, and we're going to use those principles in the next segment to plot a pie chart. You guys have done well. You've been attentive. You guys deserve a little break. I'll catch you at the end of the break. Hang in there and tune in soon. Welcome back, Life Science learners. Into our final installment today, we're looking at how to present data, and we've looked at, in the past few segments, we've looked at how we plot a line graph and how we represent information in that. In this segment, we're going to look at pie charts, and we're going to try and apply some of those skills that we've been talking about in trying to draw a line graph, and apply the skills that we need to ensure that we get the maximum marks when presenting information in the form of a line graph. So let's look at what a pie chart is. And as I mentioned, a pie chart is an illustration that shows you the proportion of substances or particles or properties that are proportionate to each other. It's often used to show the relationship or the ratios of different quantities in relation to each other. So pie charts often are used for discontinuous variables or data. By that I mean, if you're looking at a set of information that's not related, so the number of people that use a typical type of phone compared to another group of individuals that use a different type of phone. So we want to look at the proportion of individuals using different types of phones. So the one group is not related to the other. And so we illustrate that using a chart that can clearly illustrate the proportions of one group to another or one set of data to another. So it's important for you to have the following. So when when preparing to draw a pie chart, you've got to have firstly a calculator. Second, you've got to have a protractor. And it's good to also have a compass to be able to draw a circle. So the three things that you need is a protractor, a calculator, a compass, and most importantly, doing it in pencil. Because often if you make a mistake, it's easier for you to erase that off than to restart on a new set of paper because you've used pen. So do it in pencil, get it right, and then you can ink that out if it's an instruction that you have to follow. So let's look at plotting a pie chart. So the first step is that you've got to add up all the data in the table together. In this case, you will add up all the numbers in the number of women column to find out how many women took part in this investigation. So here we have a table that shows the types of contraception or contraceptive methods that we used and the number of women that are using these. And so in this column we've got that there was a group that used sterilization, a group that used the pill, some that preferred to use the condom, some that used the rhythm method, and others that chose to use none. So we've got different contraceptive methods, and so that would be our independent variable. And then we also see a column that shows the number of women that use each of these different types of them, and so this would be the dependent variable. So as I said, the first thing is to find out what is the total number of individuals that have been used in this study, and so it would require that you add these up and you get a total. So I've done that before, and we've got a total of 200. So once you've done that, you now know that the total group that we're looking at is 200. So we've got to illustrate each of these as a proportion. So it's 34 of the 200 women that are now using this specific method of sterilization. What happens next? We then need to convert the data to angles. And you know that in a pie chart, in a circle, we have 360 degrees. So we've got to illustrate each of those. If we go back, we've got to illustrate each of these groups using their numbers as a ratio out of 200, which is then converted to degrees out of 360. So that process needs to be illustrated to you now. So let's go back to that. So, as I mentioned, you've got to convert your data to angles. So essentially in this case, the 200 needs to be converted to 360 degrees. And so you're going to divide each number by 200. Then since there are 360 degrees in a circle, we've got to multiply these by 360 to get that as a proportion out of 360. So the first group that used sterilization were 34, and so we create that as a ratio, and we multiply that by 360, and we get that as a degree or proportionate amount out of 360. So that equates to 61.2 degrees. The best thing when you have degrees is to convert them to the nearest whole number. So in this case, we're going to round it down to 61. The next group used were 38 out of the 200 that chose that specific type of method of contraception, and that gave us a calculation figure of 68.4, and we can see that we rounded that off to the nearest whole number. We also looked at the next group, which was 22. We divided that by 200 and we multiplied that. And so we do this for all. What's important is that we round them down to the nearest whole number so that it does not exceed the total of 360 if we round them up. So as we round them up or down, we ensure that when we total that the total does not exceed 360. So we've done that, and we've converted the data to angles. The next step is to use your mathematical compass to draw a circle. So again, you're going to have to draw a circle and illustrate that circle, generally using pencil, and then draw the radius from the center. So once you've drawn your circle, identify the center and draw the radius. Okay? So you're going to have to draw the radius as indicated here. Okay? What happens next? You then need to draw in one radius in the circle, and you start at the exact middle of that circle, drawing a line to the edge, as I've indicated here. The next step would be using the protractor, and you need to have one, as I've illustrated here. Measure out the sectors of the pie chart according to the angles you were calculating. So the first would be placing your protractor on this. So I'm going to go back to the value on the previous slide. So we had to measure 61.2 degrees, or in this case 61 degrees. So you would then take your protractor and you would place that on this line, and you would place your protractor there, and you would measure out 61 degrees at that segment there. You would then find the next value, and the next value was 36 if I'm not mistaken, and you would place your protractor on that, and you would measure the next angle. So using a protractor at each of the segments to give you the next segment of the pie chart would be what you need to do for the rest of the values. Okay? When you're done with that, you will label each of the sections of the pie chart with the correct information. In this example, each section should be labeled with the correct contraceptive method used by the woman. Or you could provide a key for the different sections, and I've seen that learners could get creative around different kinds of illustrations that they use. So some learners tend to use circles or highlights, so you could shade out different sections using either crosses, or you can use segments, cross segments, smaller segments, or you could simply label it on here to say, well, in this case I'm going to say condoms, and this was whatever it was, 35%, and I'll illustrate that. So this gives the reader or the person looking at that information an idea as to the different proportions are composed of and by which dependent variable. So give the pie chart a heading or a caption. Remember that both variables should be included in the heading and the caption. In this example, the two variables are the type of contraception method used as well as the number. So if we go back to, let me see if I can get back to the next. So here we look at it. So here it's the pie chart showing the contraceptive used among a sample of women. So it's the different types of contraceptives used amongst a group of women. So that would be the heading. And clearly I've got a key, or I've illustrated the different segments on there clearly so that the reader or the person that's looking at this will have an idea as to which is the larger group. And hence the pie chart makes it a visual representation so that it's easier for us to be able to identify that there's a large percentage of women that are not using any contraceptive, and the least or the smallest group of women choose to use the condom. So again, it makes looking at that information much easier, and you can see the proportionate size or comparisons between different groups in trying to understand which is the most, in this case, the preferred method, or rather not, and the least preferred method by looking at the size of these little segments on the pie chart. So guys, we've looked at how to plot a pie chart. I've got an example of a question here that I've pulled out from an experiment that was conducted at the school that I am in, and I want to look at how and work with this with you together to plot a graph and see how that would be illustrated graphically from a set of data that has been collected. So let's look at this as we end off this segment. So the question is, the table below shows the number of American children between the ages of 2 months and 2 years who have died as a result of being left in a hot car for a minimum of 10 minutes. The data was collected over a period of 2 years. Carefully study the tabulated data given below and then display the data given as a line graph on the graph grid supplied, and this is an 8-mark question. So guys, this information was taken from a study done in America where they noticed that some parents had left their kids in the car to run into a shop, and they collected this data and they realized that, well, you know, the number of kids that had died from a period of being locked up in a car was alarming. And so this data was used just to look at trends in terms of, is this phenomenon happening all the time? And you know, it talks to the behavior of people. So again, information that is presented in the graph showing a trend. So let's look at how that information can be presented and a report can be generated. So here's the table. It shows you the number of deaths, and it shows you, again, due to the process called hyperthermia, which is when the temperature exceeds body temperature. And the ages of the kids that we used were between 2 months and 2 years. So we used a cohort of babies that were between the 2 months and 2 years, and this was done over a 2-year period. And it shows you that it was done in the year 2010 and the year 2011, and it shows you the number of children that died at 38 degrees Celsius, were 3 in 2010 and 4 in 2011, and so on. And if you look at the number of kids that died at when the temperature was 52 was 1 in the year 2010 and 0 in the year 2011. So how does this information, how do we read this information in a way that shows us the trend or the pattern of what has happened? So the best way to do that, again, is to present this from a table onto a graph. So let's get straight into that. So here we have a grid that I've presented to you, and we've got a set of data. So the challenge for us now is to firstly remember the rules that we were using. So let's identify the lowest value, the highest value in the dependent and independent variable. We've got to label the x and y axes. Identifying them first is important. So in this table, let's identify the variables. So we have temperature, which is the independent variable, and we have the number of deaths in the year 2010, and we have the number of the deaths in the year 2011. So we're seeing the trend for 2010, and we're seeing the trend for 2011. Now, what does this mean? When looking at this information, it talks about how the temperature changes. It also talks about how the number of individuals that are dying. So now that we have identified the dependent variable, let's look at our scale. So we've got a scale of the lowest value being 0 and the highest value being 24, if I'm correct. And we've got a scale of temperature between the temperatures of 38 all the way to 52. Now, is it important for us to start from 0? And if you look at that on the x-axis, we would have to start at 0, and it would mean that we would have most of our graph being kind of blank because we don't have a value for it. So we would need to then understand that it's not important for us to start from 0, as we don't have any information on the table for 0 degrees Celsius. So I'm going to identify this as being 37, 30, let me look at that. So we're going to go in, so 38 and 52. So if I look at that, if I look at how many blocks I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I think it's reasonable for us to be able to go and use intervals of 5. So I'm going to go and use intervals of 5, and I'm going to start with, let's try and do this. So this is going to be, I'm going to go with this being 35, 40, 45, 50, and 55. So that gives us our scale. That's correct. Remember that we've still got to label this. So this is going to be a label. If I had space on this, I would have put this as temperature. And that would be, the unit would be degrees Celsius. And then on the y-axis, it would be the number of debts, and I'll illustrate that accordingly. I will then have to illustrate my lowest value, and in this case the number of debts start from 0 and the highest is 24. So I'm going to go, so probably if I go 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 24. So that would be my scale where I go up in intervals of 2, and I would have to then plot these. But interestingly enough, you've got to remember that when looking at this, you've got 2 sets of lines. So this is going to give you, if I were to quickly plot this before we end, it's going to give you, I'm going to try and do this without having to plot the lines, so it would give you 2 lines, and those lines would show you the trend. It's important that when you have these lines that you label them, in this case the year 2010 or 2011. Notice that I've not plotted these points using the rules, I've just given you a schematic representation of them because we're running out of time, but you're going to have to complete this, and you're welcome to download these notes and the PowerPoints as well as the study notes and use these to complete this activity. Guys, we've done looking at how to present information, we've looked at types of graphs, I've tried to help you in understanding the rules of plotting a graph, we've looked at trying to plot a line graph and a pie chart, and we've attempted to solve a question where we had to present information that was presented in a table into a graphical illustration so that we could see the trend of what happens. So guys, I trust you've engaged, you've enjoyed the lesson, and that you've had a better understanding of how to present data in tables and then illustrating them using graphs. Importantly, being able to identify the type of graph and presenting that correctly. Well done for staying tuned. I wish you well. See you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.